Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. We are coming to you today from Daroga Washington State Park on the Columbia River. Our guest today is Tom Michaels, professor of horticulture at the University of Minnesota and founder at the Open Source Seed Initiative. It's pronounced Ossi, OSSI. Tom, introduce yourself.
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks very much. I'm Tom Michaels. I'm a professor of hort science at the University of Minnesota, and I like to work and teach about food crops, food plants. So I'm trying to figure out how to help you listeners put some sort of a person to a voice that you have here. And I feel a bit limited that way, but I'll say I've been married 41 years and father of three adult kids. I lived the first half of my career in Ontario, Canada, teaching at the University of Guelph, and then came to Minnesota in about 2003. As far as my background for plant breeding, really, I grew up in suburban Erie, Pennsylvania, on the shores of Lake Erie with a strong connection to water and to gardening, which my family was into, and have carried that with me. I just finished a couple days ago our third maple syrup boil of the year, and we're done with that.
Well, now that's interesting. Our theme today is horticulture and the effects of open sourcing plant material. And I want to touch a little bit on the term open source, because a lot of people are, most of our listeners will know what this is because uh, we are fairly well known in the open source world, and especially the open source database world. But for those that don't, who might be listening because of who our guest is, open source means that you have the ability in source code being what makes up all software, to change, to modify, to share under very liberal rules. And there are some, and the reason this is important to define, and you find the actual definition from opensource.org, is that there has been some companies recently who have been calling their software open source, and it is not. And in fact, there's a recent court case that came down that slapped those companies around and said, no, you cannot call your software open source if it does not comply with an open source license that has been blessed by the Open Source Initiative. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how do you open source plant material? Well, that's why Tom is here today. Tom, can you tell us a little bit what is open sourcing plant material?
Well, I come to open source, or came to open source really in the 1990s, and my entry to it was really copyleft. That was probably the idea that bored itself into me. And I came to it from looking at software just because of my interest in computers and had a young son at the time who was just getting started with some coding. And so we were looking into Linux and its ilk. And I came across News Not Unix, the GNU project,
Mm-hmm.
and I came across the idea of general public license and saw how that might apply here. And
So let me interject here. So, folks, copyleft is a play on the opposite of copyright, whereas most people understand that copyright means that you basically own the intellectual property. Copyleft, you own the intellectual property, but it is free as in rights, not free as in like price. Can share it, can modify it, and unlike some other open source, say BSD or Postgres, copyleft you cannot actually close source. Anything that you create or fork or make must be shared back to the community. And
so
Tom,
this,
is that your understanding?
yes, it is. And so my understanding of copyleft has a lot to do with freedom of use. What are my freedoms of use, for instance? And because I was looking at this in the 90s, it was really important to me because that was a time when intellectual property protection in plants was starting to take a turn toward reducing freedom of use. There are other forms of IP in plants that had done some living. There is such a thing, for instance, as plant patents that came in 1930, and then there's plant variety protection that was, I believe, 1970. So there were various types of protection that we could talk about, but just the idea that they were there. But there were no utility patents on plants until the 90s. And so as a plant breeder, I started seeing how these different forms of intellectual property protection start to reduce the scope of material that I have available to me to work with in my plant breeding work. And so this idea of freedom of use really caught my attention.
So it's interesting that you bring that up. I was hoping that you would, and I thought we would get into it a little later. But plant patents, plant patents. Why this is important, and what a lot of people don't realize, is that, as an example, uh, there is a corporation that has I can't say the word patent has got received a patent on uh, a essentially poison resistant corn, and this poison is Roundup. And Roundup is known. I mean, we all use, not all of us, but a lot of us use it in our gardens to deal with weeds and things like that. But it's also known as a carcinogen. It causes a great deal of problems. But that's not really, I think, the source of consternation here, because obviously there has to be a way to manage a large agricultural yield due to the size of population that we're trying to feed. The harder problem is that this corporation, since it has a patent on these seeds, will not allow you to harvest seeds from your crop. They have said that we have licensed you your crop. You do not own your crop, which means that this corn is planted, you harvest it, and any gardener knows that if you want to save money, one of the things you do is you harvest the seeds from your crop so that you can reuse them next season. Well, this company has made that illegal. And in fact, it has been enforced by the courts that they are allowed to license you your food. And that's a very big problem. What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
Well, the farmer, for instance, uh, signs an agreement in addition to the crop being patented with a utility patent in this case that has a number of claims that says what you can't do with it or what you can do with it. But also the grower, in order to receive the crop, needs to sign a technology use agreement, or it might come under some other type of a name. But it's a different type of IP in that it is based in contract law. So there's patent law, which covers the utility patent, and the contract law that is something that is like any other contract. You, as the farmer, agree to certain things, and essentially, it's pretty much, well, what you said. The farmer is agreeing that their use of this seed will solely be to grow a crop for commercial sale through an elevator or something like that. So it severely limits what the individual can do. And so there isn't really a sense of ownership of the seed by the purchaser, but rather a leasing, if you will, of the seed for a specific purpose.
Well, yes. And although I can certainly, from a corporation standpoint, I can absolutely see their benefit in this. But even with the lease, it's like a one season lease, right? And
That's right.
that's the larger concern here. Now, from one side, people will say, well, they put all this money and investment into genetically modifying these seeds to make them resistant to pesticides so that we can have higher yields. Now, that all sounds good. I mean, it sounds like a good thing, right? But when you look at the reality of what's happening, you have farmers who are already, uh, scraping by, having to repurchase their seed every year versus being able to harvest seed from their own fields. Not to mention that we are still learning uh, how these modifications can affect things in the pipeline, right? We are still learning, for example, how demonstrably bad high fructose corn syrup can be. It isn't always, but can be, and how it leads to, for example, obesity. But I don't want to get too far off the mark here. You've been teaching for over 40 years. I'm going to assume that you enjoy teaching or that you're very bad at something else.
I do really enjoy teaching, and I do a lot of teaching at the undergraduate level, and I tend to like working with large classes. So it's a bit of an anomaly. A lot of professors wouldn't say that, but I find it to be a great challenge, in part because one of the things I like to do is figure out new pedagogies, new ways of teaching that connect these days and that really push forward the sort of creative learning outcomes that I want to get at. So I find all that to be tremendously challenging and very rewarding too. Working with students is just great for the feedback you get, and you just are never quite sure what's going to come back at you. So yeah, it's great. I love it.
Well, I find it interesting you said that you like to teach to large audiences. I too teach. I'm not in academics. I teach professionally uh, and on PostgreSQL and other open source stuff. And I require any time that I teach that the room have no more than 22 people. Well, a couple of years ago, I was invited to teach in Moscow, and I figured there'd be 30 people. And I walked into this room, and there were 290 people.
Yes.
And I'm teaching. I mean, this isn't a theoretical topic. In fact, it was a very dense, constrained topic, which is specifically PostgreSQL replication. But the class is designed to last 3.5 hours with 22 people. And then I had 290. And I had a translator in my ear because they all were native, of course, Russian speakers and not English speakers. It was quite the challenge. You brought up that you enjoy finding the new challenges and creative ways to teach. Obviously with COVID, and I don't want to talk about COVID itself. I mean, that's just been beaten to death, but it has changed the educational and work, landscape, but more importantly, the educational landscape. How with the, a lot of schools before COVID already offered an online or remote, option. I think they kind of saw the writing on the wall, and it also enabled them a way to increase their student pool size. But COVID, the pandemic, really kind of accelerated that. What have you found, virtual hybrid tools, whatever, that seems to work for you and your students?
Well, I was lucky enough to, prior to the pandemic, have moved many of my courses to a hybrid flipped classroom sort of situation. I really like spending the time with students where we're face to face doing interaction. So while I enjoy and it's thrilling to get up and give a killer lecture, I don't always think that's the best way to approach a topic, particularly in a classroom. If you're going to be spending more than 20 minutes, you're going to lose people's attention. So I really like engaging students in some small group activities and large group activities, and we all get together at the end and share. And that's sort of a model works quite well for me. So I shifted most, I think, of my classes to our class meetings that we had face to face were all given over to interaction like that. And my lectures were all put online, and in some sort of a format, almost like a web page format, where I could include, it certainly was text heavy, but also having videos in there and audio. And I did an audio, almost like a podcast with each one. It wasn't called a podcast back then, but those sort of things. So I kind of went into the pandemic having that managed as far as content delivery. I had those things online already. The challenge was around the interaction. So We have some fabulous classrooms at the University of Minnesota that are active learning classrooms, really built for this style of flipped learning, where for even if I have 100 students in a class, have one called the edible landscape, where we teach about food plants, but also do a little bit of design. And so there it's just a really big classroom with, I don't know, we had 15 tables of 9 students. It would fit 9 students each, but I've put a few less at it. And it was just built for that sort of interaction. Okay, so now we can't do that anymore because we're in a pandemic. How do you use some of the tools, like for instance in Zoom, where you can have breakout rooms? How do you use that effectively? So I was thrilled there were breakout rooms, but what to do with them and what sort of resources to provide students who are working, all those sort of things were really intriguing and fun issues to work out and to try things. And just kind of parenthetically, let me say one of the reasons that working with undergraduate students is so great is because of how forgiving they are. I can be really upfront with students and say, here's what we're going to do. I don't quite so much propose it to them as, oh, we're going to try something really crazy that might not work. I just say, well, we're going to try this. We're going to use this approach to something and hit them with it. And I have yet to come up with something that they don't make work in some way or the other. So crazy, not crazy, but ideas that I might think might be on the edge for actually working seem to work just fine because of the resilience in students at figuring it out and making it happen. I just find that fascinating at how good they are at that.
Well, I've got two things there. One, you would have hated me as a student because I'm the student that I want. Just give me the work, I'll do it, and likely we'll turn it in early because it's I just don't want to have to deal with it. And I don't like group projects. In fact, it's one of the things that I personally struggle with quite a bit. As you know, a personal opportunity in my life is that because I am a coordinator of communities, and you kind of have to be willing to be around people if you're in a coordinator of communities. um, so it's kind of a forced, right? And it's not that I don't enjoy people, especially people that I have a relationship with. It's that I pretty much only enjoy people that I have a relationship with. And of course, there's the barrier of I have to be able to create that relationship. So you have to have that interaction that I don't want to have. It's just this weird, convoluted ball of angst against itself. That being said, we're here to talk about OSSI, which is OSSI, the open source seed initiative. And we kind of touched on like your background with Copyleft, which honestly I was surprised at. I don't know why, considering you are in the sciences and you're in academia, and GNU and Copyleft in the late 80s and early 90s was kind of the thing then. That's when I came up in the open source world as well. But let's, what is your you're a co-founder of it. Are you the founder or a co-founder of it?
Oh, co-founder. Yeah, there are a bunch of us.
Okay, so you're a co-founder of this organization. What is the specific mission for this organization?
OSSI's mission really succinctly is to try to have fair and open access to plant genetic resources. And that idea of plant genetic resources, uh, we say it that way, or I say it that way, because there are a lot of different ways that plant materials are propagated, but it mostly comes down to seed. So we really want to maintain fair and open access to seeds. And when you talk to me about OSSI, I should warn you that I look at OSSI through the lens of a plant breeder, someone who uses genetics to develop new and improved varieties, for instance, for whatever purpose. But there are others in OSSI who take have a different lens through which they look at OSSI, and that's why it was important for a group of us to come together and put this in place, because I might look at it in one way Another person in the group might look at it from its impact on rural communities, or a third person might look at it from the standpoint of seed sales, for instance. And so there are just a lot of different lenses. And I'll just mention off the top that I look at it as a plant breeder. So what that means is that I look at OSSE and this sort of idea of fair and open access to plant genetic resources as being able to use other varieties than my own when I make crosses. Because at the very start of the process, usually in plant breeding, is a is sexual recombination. It's a cross between two plants of the same species. And so where do you get those plants? Where do you even start? Well, a really common way to start, not to get it into the weeds and make you and your listeners all plant breeders, but you usually start with some sort of a variety that's currently being used that's pretty good, but it might have some flaws. Maybe there's a new disease resistance or new disease that's coming up, or maybe it needs some changes to the novelty of its colors or flavors or whatever it is. And so then you cross that otherwise good variety with another plant of the same species that has those characteristics you want. So it's simple. It's not earth shattering. You take something good and cross it with something that has characteristics you want to impart. And then you look through the progeny with a fine tooth comb over many years, looking for that great combination of the two. So now if suddenly there is intellectual property protection, for instance, like utility patents, which do this, and also the contract law that I was mentioning before, the technology use agreements that prohibit using these commercially available varieties in breeding, you're kind of stuck. Not stuck because there's other material you can use, but you're limited. And just the mathematics of plant breeding is that the greater your genetic diversity that you're working with, the greater your potential gain from selection. So when I see these restrictions on what I can use in my breeding program, I'm sensing that the room's getting smaller. The walls are starting to come in, and suddenly I don't have the freedom to operate to make as much genetic gain as I can. So that's how I look at the mission of the organization, trying to have that fair and open access to plant genetic resources.
Well, see, there's an interesting point here. That's kind of the whole point of open source, right? If you, any healthy open source community, you have a divergence of opinions about what's particularly important and what's not. And the idea is to come together as a general consensus to move that community forward. Now, you've said a couple of things in that introduction to your lens for Aussie that really touches on a lot of important factors. It's not just plant breeding, right? You said that the diversity of selection that you have, the greater selection you have more potential gain. And that applies, I think, and a lot of people don't think about this. It also applies, for example, if you're a dog breeder. It's one of the reasons why you're having issues with, quote unquote, purebreds, because there's no diversity within the gene pool, and therefore they're starting to mutate in ways that are disadvantaged. You also see this in society as a whole, as you see people shutting down opinions and thoughts and discourse across the board just because you don't agree or like what the individual has to say. We're, there are some communities that are becoming particularly siloed in their thought process, and it doesn't even matter what spectrum of politics or whatever you're on there. It's happening in many places, and I think that, honestly, I mean, if we look at the lens of the world, as of society, as humans, the way that you're looking at plants, we'd actually probably be in a better spot as a general rule. I mean, outside of plants. Um, and but I don't think, what I'm trying to hone in on here is, how do we implore people to understand without sounding like ideologues, why this topic is important, right? Because this isn't just about, oh, I want to be able to have that certain rainbow hue of a rose, for example. This is about our literal food sources, right? And if anybody's out there like, well, I would usually, I eat meat. Well, guess what meat eats? It eats plants, unless
Sure.
unless it's on a feed lot in which they feed it all kinds of things it shouldn't eat. So can you explore that a little bit with me, kind of expound on why this is such an important topic?
Well, the first thing that came to mind is the concentration of industries in agriculture, which may not be something that we all think about, but there is a fellow whose name escapes me at Michigan State University who puts together some fabulous diagrams of what has happened within the seed industry over the last few decades. And it is absolutely alarming in terms of how we started out, well, let's say in the 1970s when I was going to graduate school, every state, just even looking at in the Midwest at corn production, every state had a bunch of small hybrid corn producers. And frankly, they were kind of reworking the same old crosses, but by golly, they were independent and they were serving a local clientele, and that sort of personal touch was very important. And those seed industries over the years either went out of business or became absorbed by other companies. And this idea of acquisition has done nothing but accelerate, I think, until now when we have, I'm going to get this number wrong, but maybe 5 international companies that are dominating agriculture, and particularly in particular seed. And so I hate saying things like, can you imagine if, because that's so vague in general, but the I sense that there is a problem, a lack of diversity, and some lack of resilience too, if we start relying on too few companies to bring us such important things as agricultural seeds. When it's just a few companies around the world, it starts bothering me to the point of maybe even scaring me that we've put all our eggs in such a few baskets. Now, that's primarily for commodity crops, I have to say. There are an awful lot of crops that are not addressed by these big groups. And that itself is a problem too, because where we have these large companies who are investing huge amounts of money to make gain from selection in a few commodity crops, it creates this thing called orphan crops. And those are crops that are no longer really worked on. They're not worked on all that much by private industry because there's just not the margin there for making the money back on some of these innovations. And they're decreasingly being addressed at institutions like universities too, where we once had many plant breeders working on regionally important crops. Those positions are going away and being replaced by the next important thing. And there are plenty of them at universities, so I don't really bemoan that. It's just who is there for these orphan crops? Who is breeding a crop like quinoa? Well, you mentioned Oregon State and Washington State being up in that sort of general area. There are people up there doing that at universities, but maybe there's just one or maybe two in the whole US. And so where's the community, the group of people who can think together about how to do these improvements? It used to exist, and those things are not there nearly in the way they used to be in the past.
It's interesting that you bring that up. While you were talking, I did a quick search, and it's actually 4 companies, 4 corporations
Ah,
control more than 50% of the world's seeds.
how does that sound to you?
Well, as an open source guy and an anti-monopoly guy and a pro-competition guy and an educated gentleman, I think it sounds terrible.
Yeah.
And this is why. There's a couple of different points here. Point one, I think, is important. Where's the community to share that connection, that intellectual discourse to hopefully make things better. But there's another problem, and I alluded to this in the dog breeders, purebreds. They, all the problems they have. If we end up in a world food supply where the majority of our food is only, say, four things, we are going to start to have problems because there is no diversity in the plant gene pool and thus the nutrient gene pool that we are consuming. And if you don't believe me, you should look at the actual scientific medicinal side effects of too much soy, right? Now, that's not that soy is bad. Soy itself is not bad, but it can cause problems if you consume too much of it. The same with corn, right? We're supposed to have a diversity in our food supply. And when you end up in a situation where you have these high yield crops, corn and soy specifically, but there's others that are controlled by essentially four companies, which means you have four companies that are feeding the majority of the world, and they're not really in competition with each other. Once you reach a certain size and penetration of market, you can say, well, there's that company or that company. Now, replace the words Bayer, Corteva, Kim China, and Limagrain. Now, let's replace those and let's put this into something that some of our listeners will understand very clearly. Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook/Meta. There is no actual competition in these markets. There's no competition on the side that our average listener is going to understand. They're going to say, well, no, there actually isn't any competition because they control the information to the world. They control how I see, buy my ebooks, how I get my email, how I use my computer, which is especially important. And Tom, I think you'll appreciate this, why copyleft and open source is so important in technology. I shouldn't say technology because what you're doing is technology. It's the core of technology. I should say in computers and software, right? It's the same thing with our food source, except here's the difference. Folks, think about this. You can turn off your computer. If you don't eat, you die. So this is why something like Aussie is so important, because guess what? Companies go out of business, they make mistakes, they purposely do bad things. Not saying any of these companies are doing that, but historically speaking, humans are flawed. They make bad decisions, they make selfish decisions, and those decisions end up being bad. And a lot of times it's for, cutting corners. We don't need this particular plant to be this particular resistant because we're planting it here and therefore we save 30%. But the part they don't tell you is that it has a decreased efficiency of vitamin A absorption, as an example. I'm not speaking factually. And therefore, children who are intaking this food, their eyesight is worse. That type of thing. And so, Tom, I mean, am I on point here, or am I just kind of demagoguing?
No, I think you are on point. And if I could just add to the the types of examples you're talking about, if you look at the characteristics that are being improved in plants, and where this really interest, I have to say, as a geneticist, the approaches that are being used, and the technology for this sort of plant breeding is just fabulous. It's really, I mean, the advances are great, and so it's very exciting. But you know where it gets used, and you alluded to this in what you were saying, it is mostly focused on changing crops for the benefit of producers and for the benefit of the seed companies themselves, rather than for the benefit of consumers. Now, there are some examples that of where changes to the crop that benefit consumers have taken place, but it's really the minority. You were mentioning before the resistance of plants to glyphosate, which is the generic ingredient name for Roundup. And that's an example. So some of the very big things that are happening in crop plants is how do you stack together several different types of traits, which might include an herbicide resistance, as well as a disease resistance, as well as an insect resistance, like using BT, uh, and putting those, creating what they call stacked hybrids. And very innovative, really interesting, works well uh, toward that particular goal. But we haven't really talked then about nutrient density, for instance, or even things that are important in a culinary sense, like flavor or color or any of those things. Those are not very high on the list. Part of that's because when we take a look at corn and soybeans, which are the two crops that get so much attention, how are they used? Well, corn is used either as an animal feed or it's used for ethanol production. And so the idea of making a really good tasting tortilla isn't, it's not that important. It's not how the crop is used, even though in our own minds, we might try to relate those crops to the corn chips that we ate. And soybean, likewise, what do we do with that? We mostly squeeze it for oil. And then what's left over after we take the oil out is a high protein concentrate that also goes into animal feed. So the point of producing soybean in the U.S. is not to make tofu. It's to feed animals and to make oil that's either incorporated into recipes or used for.
So you touched on a couple of really good things there. You said DT. Did you mean DDT?
No, BT. I'm sorry, Bacillus thuringiensis. So this is it's a toxin from a bacterium that actually interferes with lepidopterans, so things that make butterflies. It interferes with their digestion. There are these crystals. Now I'm getting into the weeds here, but there are these crystals that are produced in the gut of the larva of these organisms that destroys them, and they can be very important insects that cause damage in plants, in commercial plants. So having this toxin, it's actually a organic growers would use this bacterium, raise the bacterium and spray it on their crops to get a natural, if you will, I'm making hand quotes here, natural form of this insecticide, but through biotechnology can actually take the, the gene construct that in the microorganism produces this toxin and slap it into your target plant, and it is expressed then and
Okay,
expressed just in the tissues where you want it.
that's interesting because I'm actually looking at this as you speak, and it's actually BT. It says it's a microbe that's naturally found in soil.
Yes.
And what you're essentially saying is that we have this natural thing that we've injected with steroids and and then injected into the gene or DNA of a plant so that as a caterpillar, for example, tries to eat the plant, it can't. Is
Right.
that boil it down to explain it like I'm five?
That works.
Okay. So for people who don't understand why this is bad, there's a reason why you can't dope in professional Olympics, right? It's actually bad for you. Although I do understand, I mean, this is a tough subject because in order to generate the food supply that we need in terms of volume, there's really only that I can think of. There's only two fundamental real options, and then I'm going to bring up a third option that is still in its infancy. One is that everyone starts to grow at least some of their own food, right? Which will reduce the centralized impact of billions and billions of acres of agriculture and basically artificial growth, right? We don't even grow corn anymore. It is this other thing that looks like corn but certainly doesn't taste like corn, and it has a different nutritional profile. Same with the soy, right? um, and if everyone starts growing at least a little bit of their own food, that'll help. or we need to drastically and continuously modify the structures of plants to increase yield, make them insect resistant, disease resistant, in theory, more nutritious. But as you mentioned, that's not really a priority. The priority is calories, um, and that type of thing. Then there's the third, and this is something that has been coming along. I mean, I remember reading about it decades ago, and I actually just met a gentleman who does this. He's a botanist, and he's out of my hometown of Bellingham, Washington, and he focuses on vertical gardening. And I don't want to get off too much on this because that's not the topic that we're discussing today. But the point being is vertical gardening allows us to grow up versus out. Think suburban sprawl versus skyscraper for farms. But, Tom, like you said, when you get to a point where there's no diversity and who controls the food source, doesn't that food source then no longer, it becomes not even a commodity, it becomes something to control the populace.
True.
And we're seeing this now in a minor form in your world, which it's not minor to you, but I mean minor to the world, where you don't have the access to all the seeds and all the genetic material to, let's say, aptly or correctly blend these plants to make a better plant. Does that make sense?
It it does. One way that I'd like to step back a little bit though is I try not to demonize some parts of the industry and then treat others as if they're angelic, because I don't think that's the case. Uh, and that's not the case with Aussie either. At least again, wearing my lens for Aussie. Early on, when groups of us just got together and talked about what would become Aussie, there were some notions about what can we do to inhibit uh, some of these companies from doing the things that they do. Could we sue them, for instance? Well, all those sort of approaches fell short, maybe because our pockets weren't deep enough or whatever the reason is. And I think we quite well, I'm going to say quite wisely, but that's we're patting ourselves on the back doing that. But I think it was the right choice to say, let's not try to say that these other guys are awful and shouldn't exist and what they're doing is wrong. Let's say, here's another model. And if you're attracted to that model, then please support it. So I always put forward Aussie not as a replacement, but as another model. And the people who get it right away and say, yes, that is a model that I really connect with. So, for instance, I had no idea when we started Aussie that the sort of breeders that would want to pledge new varieties to Aussie would be independent plant breeders. First of all, because I'm in this institution and always have been at the universities and trained by you. I, I had this blinkered idea of who breeds plants. I thought it was people like me, and that's not always the case. Yes, it's a big part of it, but there are people who do this on a much smaller scale, maybe working with just a few species who focus on, for instance, developing new varieties for sale through maybe their own seed catalog or maybe to organic growers. And you can see all kinds of these people who have developed varieties for the seed catalogs that we might work with to choose the varieties for our next garden. So there are people with whom this Aussie idea resonates and they want to be part of it and they're absolutely driving this thing forward. So the point just that I wanted to make is I try not to think about who's bad and who's good in this thing. I want to think about here's a different model. And if it appeals to you, that's why we developed it and we'd like you to participate.
I agree with you, and I wasn't demonizing or I wasn't trying to demonize the corporations themselves. The issue that I am taking is with the centralization of power, right? Great quote. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not that these come, I don't believe, as a general rule, I don't believe that anybody or any corporation is evil, because every company is made up of people. And especially corporations of this size, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, or if not millions of people. And so it's this big, very slow modifying, moving organism. And I also believe that these corporations, in a lot of ways, are actually trying to do good, uh, and they're trying to solve a problem, or answer a need, right? Um, but sure, of how larger corporations evolve, it ends up taking something from society in the process. And I don't honestly know that there's a way out of that problem, right? You talk to some people who are like, well, just ban big corporations. It should only be, once you get so big, you should be broken apart, right? Well, okay, that's an interesting theory, except that I don't care if you have a million 5-acre farms, they're not going to be able to work together to provide the level of food that is required, right? Because what you have with a million 5-acre farms is a million different priorities. Whereas with a corporation, say Bayer, their specific priority for what their horticulture or agricultural division is grow as much reasonably safe corn as possible at a markup so we can feed our employees and the world, right? And you make sacrifices when that happens. So I agree with you, Tom. We do have to, it's a different option. So with Aussie, I find this, so you're working with plant catalogs, you're working with communities, hobby farmer or hobby farms and hobby horticulturalists. Is there anything that's come out of this outside of the surprise of the diversity of the people that are coming to your project? Is there anything that's come out of this that was like a light bulb, like, I can't believe I never thought it would be this way, and now it is.
Uh, I never thought it would really work. How's that?
I,
Isn't that
that's
awful?
fair. No, not at all. I mean,
So I'm not by nature the sort of entrepreneurial guy who goes into things with that overwhelming confidence that makes it work. Luckily, I do work with people like that. So my problem was that back in the 90s I had this idea and I wrote a little bit about it and I called it general public license for plant breeding. And it wasn't Aussie, but it was part of the idea that be, that became Aussie along with many other things. But I didn't know what to do with it, and I basically said I told my colleagues, I gave a couple of conference papers about it, and I thought, well, that's that. And it took other people to really make it happen. So sometimes when I look at the Aussie website, I just shake my head and think, holy cow, if it had just been me, it never would have happened. But to have these other people who know how to take a concept and actually make it real, uh, that's fabulous. So that's why I didn't think it would happen. Not because it's not a good idea, not because they aren't good people. In fact, quite the opposite. Turns out it's a good idea, and there are great people behind it. So there you go.
that's absolutely fair. I mean, when I started Command Prompt, well, I didn't have any choice really to except to make it succeed, because I kept getting fired from companies. Um, it's the absolute truth. But it's widely known that what is it? Some over 50% of startups fail in their first 5 years, and we've been around since '97. So there was a great deal of luck, a great deal of determination, a great deal of failure, and a great deal of success, but we're still here. this idea of I myself, the reason we reached out to you is that I had read an article about what I had mentioned in the beginning of this podcast about only being able to, this farmer got sued by one of the seed companies, and I was just blown away at this idea. And it was late at night, and I typed in open source seeds, and sure enough, Aussie came up. So and the only reason I even typed it in is because of my experience with open source software, right? And I said, I wonder, Google knows all at this point, even if it doesn't always tell you the truth. Let's do a little search. And sure enough, there you were. And now here we are talking. And I mean, this is going to be a little abstract here, this segment. But one of the things that I kind of want to drill down on, and it's not about open source seeds as much, is that it's about open source software, except that I'm not talking about the software that runs your computer. I'm talking about the software that runs the world, which wouldn't that be DNA? And that's just code. It's biological code. Is that accurate?
Yeah. We had a bunch of discussions about this when we were trying to get at what is at the core of what we are doing. And the one piece that makes DNA perhaps a little bit different is that, first of all, it's self-replicating, or it's in an organism that replicates it for us. Plus, it has built-in mechanisms for change. So unlike, I don't know enough about coding other than uh, COBOL, believe it or not, and Fortran and BASIC. But anyway, this idea that an organisms can self-replicate and it can change and it has the mechanisms for adaptation, those things make it really unique. And so I tend to think of DNA as just as DNA, and I don't try to create too many analogs, except that I absolutely understand of it as being kind of thought of as source code.
Right. Well, and where I was coming, you've heard the term, genetic code,
Yeah,
right? And that source of your genetic code is
right.
DNA. And obviously, we are aware that not only can it change, self-replicate, it can also mutate. Sometimes the mutations are good. You read about these odd mutations where the body just continues to build muscle, so you end up very, very strong. It's much stronger than a normal human, even those who would, bodybuilders or something like that. But also bad things like cancer. But the interesting thing to me, there's this correlation that if software is code and DNA is code, it's genetic code. At some point, we have to recognize that everything that we're doing over here on these computers is actually artificial. And I'm not going to go into artificial intelligence and things like that. That's not what I mean. Versus something that's a little deeper and frankly, I would think a lot less understood, which is DNA and genetics. We're constantly learning new things about that versus software code, which generally speaking, we know what we're going to know about software code. It's just we're learning new ways of doing old things. It's either faster or prettier, or processors can manipulate it in a different way, that type of thing. But I mean, at least in the last, as long as I've been in the industry, so 30 years, and I'm sure you've run into this as well. Someone comes up with some new buzzword. The favorite is cloud, right? You got to be in the cloud. Well, the cloud's been around since the 70s. It's just continued to evolve and grow up and mature through those decades to what it is now, the cloud. And my curiosity here, and I guess I'm kind of getting into the weeds as well, is there, so you have this general public license for plant germplasm, which is a whole lot of words for general, basically a general public license for anything that can replicate a plant, whether it be a seed or a cutting or something like that. Is there a deeper, more concise, not even deeper, a simpler, more concise license that should be applied as a whole to, I don't want to say humanity because that's not really where I'm going with it. Like the organism itself, right? Should there be an understanding that we can't patent or copyright life, no matter on whatever level it is?
Oh my, the problem, JD, is that's kind of water under the bridge, isn't it? And I know you're speaking philosophically, but we cross that bridge. And at least in this country, uh, wise people, quote, I'm making those air quotes again, just decided that you could. And so now what? And, and so let me reach back into that philosophical sort of direction that you were going, and saying that so much of this to me is wrapped up in the notion of sharing. And that concept of sharing is something that we often, without even thinking about it, apply locally on the with others in with my neighbors, or with others in my block or in my community. But as we start getting more distance from people, this idea of sharing becomes more obscure and actually gets sidelined somehow. And yet when we're talking about seeds and we're talking about Aussie, really it's about sharing. And we have a twist in it, which is kind of the copy leftish sort of piece, where we also say, and if it was shared with you, then you need to share it with others. So that's kind of the philosophy behind it, really, is we want to share with you, and we want you then to pass that on and share with others. So that would be the concept. If we kind of take a look at humanity, uh, at humans and how humans interact, can we hive off a piece of that interaction that involves sharing, and sharing not just with people we know, with family, but with people who are uh, neighbors in the world, but not necessarily next door people, just people. So how do we share? So yeah, to me, it's transferable. I think we could take a look at just about any industry and say, what does sharing mean here? And I think within seeds, one of the examples of sharing is Aussie.
So let's talk about the sharing. How do we share within the concept of Aussie? I mean, do you have a database of seeds that are open source, for lack of a better term?
We do, and we actually require that to be considered Aussie. A seed needs to be, uh, breeders need to apply to have their seed considered Aussie. And they become considered Aussie if, first of all, we recognize that it is unique. It isn't as if it is somebody else's seed that someone has grabbed and said, I want to make this Aussie. That's not going to cut it. It needs to be something that you have developed using methods that we as geneticists and breeders will recognize as creating novel material. And so it is, to use a possessive, it's yours. It's something that you developed. And so that's really the major criterion. Is it something unique and yours? And if you want to pledge it to Aussie, that's great. You need to declare that you're doing that. And it will be, I'm trying to think if there are very many more hurdles to jump. No, that's pretty much it. So we do have that database, and we also, as we do have some requirements or requests of those who sell Aussie seed, that just like with general public license with software, you need a copy of not just the source code, but also the fact that it is general public license needs to be passed on to the next user so that they know and they're aware and they know what that means and they know their obligations to also share and to pass that information on to the next people. So we've worked really hard to try to make that also happen uh, with our seeds. So if you look in a catalog, for instance, you will see if they are selling Aussie seed, there's going to be the Aussie symbol right next to that seed in their catalog. And somewhere in their catalog or in their online presence is a description of what that means so that people know.
Fair enough. Now, you may not know this, but I have to ask since we run a database consultancy. Do you know what database software you're using?
Not a no.
It was worth a shot. It was worth a shot.
I
Because
do
I
not.
happen to know a really good database if you're looking to migrate or upgrade, or maybe you're already using it.
I may end up talking to you about that.
Anytime, because it is open source, PostgreSQL. So we certainly can talk about that. I'm on the site right now, the Aussie site, OSS EEDS. So it's open
Oh,
source seeds,
right.
basically. Yeah, OSSEEDS.org. And I clicked on the seed database. It's actually really interesting here. I picked on a garlic. I'm not even going to pretend to be able to pronounce the name of this garlic. But I like this because one of the things that you're doing in true open source fashion, you're being very transparent. We know what kind of crop it is. It's a garlic crop. The use type, in case it's non-standard, is a standard use type. Who the breeder is, when they pledged to OSSI, when it was released, whether it can be, it looks like bred for organic systems. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that it will thrive in an organic system, or that it's was bred in an organic system?
It typically, I'm going to say it's both things. That is, many of the breeders that we work with do their breeding in organic systems. And they also do their evaluation and testing in organic systems. So they have a nice comparison. They have an opportunity to compare what their new line looks like versus other lines in organic. So typically bred in that situation, but also evaluated in an
Okay.
organic situation.
Fair enough. And then it also says commercial availability, yes or no. But, and this is interesting, you say variety type. Now, this particular garlic is a finished variety. I'm assuming that what we mean here is that we are no longer trying to make it more garlicky. It is, the seed is the seed is the seed.
Yeah, it also is a signal to a potential breeder that this variety is going to be uniform. That is, there's no genetic variability likely from one garlic clove to the next in these. These are asexually propagated, so that means that it would not be a good variety for you if you decided you wanted to start breeding garlic. Would you start with this one? Well, maybe not. You wouldn't be able to do any selection within it. And it's probably easier to understand if I draw the contrast with a particular company that does a lot with us as far as Aussie seed. It's called Wild Garden Seed, and it's out in Oregon. And the breeder there is a lettuce breeder, Frank Morton, and Frank makes available on his website, now in his seed catalog, things that he calls lettuce mixes. And a lettuce mix is created by him first making that cross between two different lines. The contrast I wanted to make was between a finished variety and what else is there, right? And this guy, Frank, makes the crosses between a couple of different lettuce lines, selects the stuff that he wants, the reason that he made the cross, that he might want to try to commercialize, and he packages up the rest of the seed and says, here, I'll sell it to you. And if you come up with anything, it's Aussie material. And if you select it and it works well, it's your variety. So you can, in addition to getting things that are finished varieties, you can get what might be called breeding populations. And that's the signal then to others that, hey, I'm not going to expect this to be uniform. In fact, quite the opposite. It's going to be very diverse. And because of that diversity, I might be able to find something in there that is better for my situation. And not only that, this seed has freedom of use. And so I can propagate that seed and I can sell that seed and I can call it mine. All the while honoring Frank as being the one who originated the cross, but nevertheless, it has freedom of use.
That, I mean, as an open source advocate, I mean, this is, I never even would have thought, right? Even myself as a master gardener, I did not know this world existed. For our listeners, I know what it means, but for our listeners, you did mention something that I just thought that might be interesting for them to understand without having to Google. What is asexual propagation for plants?
Well, a good example is a potato, where if you're familiar with potato gardening, you don't plant seed. You take a potato tuber and you cut it up into pieces so each piece has an eye and a new plant grows from that eye. So you are propagating the plant by taking something vegetative. It didn't go through sexual recombination. It's just a vegetative part of the plant and using that to make more plants. When people make cuttings of their coleus plants indoors and take one plant and cut it up into little pieces and maybe grow 5 of them and give them away, that's asexual propagation, so without sex. But a seed does go through the sexual cycle. If you studied biology in college, then it means that the type of cell division that's involved is called meiosis, not mitosis. We'll see if your listeners know that stuff. And so that is the sexual phase of the plant.
Okay, so we are running out of time here, and honestly, I I could talk to you all day. Uh, so let me ask you this: where, how can we expand this use? Right? You said now we have another option. We don't have to go or another view. We now have this community, and it's a worldwide community who is sharing, like you said, which is an awesome thing. And specifically in this situation, although I guess technically it doesn't, it's not always food, right? It might be an inedible flower. Is that correct? Or are we
Yes,
only
it is
dealing?
correct. No, you
Okay.
are correct.
Um, so in my particular interest in this would obviously be towards food-based crops and ways to make high quality food more available to anyone. I am privileged in that I am able to buy my cow from the rancher next door, right, and my pig from the farmer down the road. And so the food that I'm able to consume is of quite a bit, and I'm if you've ever done this, you'll know it's an exceptionally higher level than even the best you can get from the store, which would be USDA choice. Um, but in the vegetation world, in the plant world, I think the same thing applies. I mean, if anyone has ever gone to a small local farmers market and gotten local kale, the texture, the taste, everything is better than whatever you get at some major supermarket, and there's logistical reasons for that. But why, or not why, but how can we expand this? How can OSSI, or how can people do more to help OSSI to be able to expand your mission and the community's mission, as diverse as it is, to have more access to this?
The first place I'd start with that is by asking people to be aware that this other model exists, that it is called Aussie, and that seed catalogs that they look at, if they happen to be gardeners, may well carry some Aussie seed. And it doesn't mean they have to buy it, but see that it's there and take a look and recognize that there is that alternative model out there and that it's thriving. And the second thing is to recognize that they can be part of it. And this is sometimes hard maybe for people who are not really tightly connected with agriculture to recognize how that yes, they can have a place in it. We were talking about this lettuce varieties that you can select yourself. One of the cool things about lettuce is that it self-pollinates. It's an inbred variety and it self-pollinates. And what that means is that if you save seed off a lettuce plant that you really liked, then that seed will all produce the same lettuce again. And that's super powerful because it means you can do selection yourself in your own garden. And by seed saving, you can propagate some material that you really liked. I think that's so powerful and something that people can do. And it just takes that enjoyment of gardening to a different level. It's just fabulous to be able to grow your own salad, and just that sense of accomplishment. But to also know that, this salad would simply look better if I had some red leaf lettuce in it. And you could develop that variety yourself just through selection and saving seed. Wouldn't that be just cool as heck? And that would be taking it to another level.
So, yes, I agree with you. And something I'd like to lend to people who listen to this and think, oh, I could never do XYZ. One of the great things about you bringing up lettuce is that it is dumb simple to grow. Maybe not all lettuces, but lots of lettuces. It's very easy to grow, and you can grow it in your windowsill. The Another one is green onions is a really easy one. Um, but so I would agree. Now, do you have on the site? I'm on the site again, and I'm I'm trying to focus on the podcast, so I don't want to get too directed. But is there a place that I can click? You have your seed database, and that's awesome. And I noticed that you have on the seed database the ability to go to the people that produced the seed or modified the seed. But is there a place to know, for example, which catalogs will explicitly carry your seeds, even if they
Down at
carry it with other seeds?
Yeah, down at the bottom should be a list of who we know carries it. So I'm going to take peppers, for instance, and take a look at those real quick. Come on,
Oh,
database.
is it is I know a database, but it's very fast and reliable.
I'm just hoping that no, mine's okay. So yeah, so I just picked up Bella Italia, which is a red pepper, and took a look at the bottom, and it says availability from Aussie Seed Company partners, and right down there is the name of a company that carries it, along with an active link that takes you to their homepage. Actually, takes you to the page of that variety there. So we try to support those who sell our seeds by making sure that if someone comes to osseeds.org and finds something they're interested in, that they can go back to the company and find out who's selling it.
And it appears you also have, I'm on another part of the database, which is your seed company partners,
Yes.
which is awesome. All right. Well, Tom, this has been a fantastic conversation. And I, I think that what you're doing is truly amazing. I mean, yes, flowers are important too, but as I alluded to, the big thing for me, the thing that struck my chord was the food availability and the food diversification, and you're enabling anyone uh, to be able to do that, and it's just so vitally important. Um, and the fact that you're doing it in a copyleft, I'm actually more of a BSD style guy, but in this case, I absolutely agree that the copyleft makes more sense. And for those that don't know, the difference is very simple. Copyleft, you have to share. BSD, you do not. Um, and so in this particular case, in trying to grow something where you are ensuring the shareability and ensuring the community of what you're building, a copyleft makes perfect sense. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it.